Good evening, Internet. Thank you again for joining us on our Course for Nowhere. I am Course of your Captain, the Media Nomad. With me, as always, is the ever-lovely Ivy.
Hello, everyone.
And with me, also with us tonight, we have a special guest. It was DJ Armah.
Just Armah Core.
Armah Core. Armah Core?
Armah, A-R-M-A Core. C-O-R-T-H.
All right, what he said. This is the guy who's with us tonight.
All right, that sounds good.
And I want all of you to treat him with the same professionalism that I do.
Right.
Nothing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There we go. So I was gonna run down to the coffee shop and grab like a cup of coffee, like a snack, before we started, because it's the Breath of the Wild drop today, and I've done nothing but play Zelda since about 9 in the morning. It's about 7:30 p.m. right now. Went down to the coffee shop, got to the end of my street, realized they were closed, and I actually did the hardcore Darth Vader, no, and I just walked back to the apartment. So anyone watching this would have seen a guy run out in about a foot of snow with just a hoodie and some jeans, walk to the end of his block, scream, and then just walk back home.
Nice. I did something similar in the grocery store once when I couldn't find the particular brand of toilet paper I like.
Not two-ply.
I like the tube-free kind. Don't have to mess with all those cardboard tubes. It makes it easier.
No, I gotta have my 2-ply, man. You need that extra ply.
I didn't realize they made tube-free.
Wait,
Yeah,
tube-free is a thing?
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't quite...
You gotta find it.
How does it work?
They just, you get to the end and it's just paper. It doesn't, sometimes the last piece or two is a little bit raggedy from going around the thing, but, who cares?
What do you make trumpet noises in when you're done?
Or what do you put laundry detergent sheets at the end of and smoke weed out of so it doesn't smell anymore out of?
Yeah,
right.
That thing.
Well, they don't yet make tubeless paper towel rolls.
Ooh. Bounty. There you go. $1 million idea. Save it.
Yeah.
For the one bounty exec who's listening to this. No, it's Bronny's going to be listening to this and going, no. We're going to scoop that bounty.
You snubbed me. I'm not doing this now.
He's going to realize this is my chance. I'm going to steal that.
So how is The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild?
It's absolutely beautiful. I've had a really rough year this last year, and I've had a lot going on, and booting up that game and finding the rebuilt Temple of Time, it was like coming home. It was beautiful, and I loved it.
That's nice.
Hence why I didn't eat, and now I'm shoveling cake in my face.
I was watching a video where you can snowboard on your shield.
I haven't done that yet, because the game is huge.
That looks really amusing.
Yeah, so mostly we're just trying to hammer home the idea to you as a new co-host that we are in no way, shape, or form anywhere near any professional caliber. We're pretty terrible.
Yeah, we just kind of shoot the shit and hope that turns out into something that people might want to listen to.
I was actually really stoked. Oh, go ahead.
But also don't really give a shit if anybody wants to listen to it or not.
Well, that's what it's all about. There's a famous Dave Grohl quote about starting a band, where I'm paraphrasing here, but he said something along the lines of, start out, suck together, and then eventually you'll get good. So, I believe the same rules apply to anything. And when you first get with a group of people, you gotta hammer out those details and just get comfortable with each other. So, I'm just happy to be here. And be starting a podcast journey with you guys right now.
It's a lovely journey, and that actually helped us segue into our topic today. Normally we do movies or TV. Occasionally we'll delve into books. But today we have our very first episode where we are actually talking about music.
Yes, it's a significant change of pace for us. And talking about Breath of the Wild also a little bit ties into it because Sam is... I'm sorry.
You've ruined it! We have to start over! You've destroyed my secret identity!
I used your real name! Oh god. No, that is not his real name at all. Definitely not.
I mean, why would you out Armah Core like that?
At any rate, the Media Nomad is more of an action, like an action RPG or maybe tactical RPG player. Whereas I've been pretty staunchly JRPG gamer from the get-go. And today, we are talking about the SNES Final Fantasy games music. That would be 4, 5, and 6. Releases 2 and 3 in the US originally.
Great games, from what I understand. I never had the opportunity to play them when I was younger, although I did have the Super Nintendo. I didn't come into playing Final Fantasy until Final Fantasy VII on the PS1, because at the time, I was a little bit younger than a lot of people, and I wasn't in that gaming scene so much until the PS1 dropped. I had an older brother. He had a Super Nintendo, but I was playing what he exclusively wanted to play, of course, because I didn't have any money. So
as go the older siblings, so goes the house.
That's right. So I was playing a lot of... I don't know if you remember this game, but it was called Top Gear, which was just this awful racing game, and it was a whole lot of fun. I was playing Super Metroid left and right. Super Metroid was my opus and still is one of my favorite games. And then they also had one called Killer Instinct, which was a fighting game.
God, I love Killer Instinct.
Great game.
Sorry, go ahead.
Great game. Good music, too. That's another really well thought out soundtrack. Very ominous and creepy. What were you going to say, Ivy?
I'm old enough that at the time when my older brother was the one playing all the games, we had a Nintendo, the original Nintendo. And so by the time we got to the SNES, I was old enough to kind of understand, and my older brother also got into RPGs. We actually rented Final Fantasy II from the video rental store and ended up buying their copy from them because, you know, my brother had made his save and we were...
Right, because cartridges.
Right, yeah. And so we were like, we want this one. Can we have it? And, yeah.
Now the question was, what video game store was it? Was it the Blockbuster or was it Hollywood Video?
No, it was actually a local one called Cecil B's.
Oh my.
That sounds magical.
It does, doesn't it?
It does.
And actually, the main character in Final Fantasy 2/4 is Cecil.
You know, as long as we're putting stuff into context, 4 is the only Final Fantasy I've ever played, and I have not played it to completion. I got about as far as the moon, and then I couldn't grind anymore, and Bahamut kept kicking my ass, and I decided, you know what, I just started college, because I played the remake, and I decided, I got too much other crap to do. I don't have the time to grind to beat this one dude for weeks on end.
Yeah, the final dungeon also can be pretty brutal by the time you get to the last couple screens of the final dungeon are all boss fights. Like, your random encounters become boss-level fights.
Ew. That sounds really tough.
It is pretty tough by the time you get to the end, but actually, on the Super Nintendo version, they made it easier for the US because they figured that American audiences weren't up for that.
That's interesting to say because there's, in Final Fantasy VII, which is the one I've played a lot, they have these things called weapons. And there's one one at the bottom of the ocean. There's one that flies around, and there are a couple of other hidden ones. One in like a desert, and they added those specifically for American audiences because they thought we needed more of a challenge. They made them nigh impossible to beat. You had to go through a lot of fighting, a lot of grinding, a lot of item search to be able to find what you needed to beat them in the first place. Because the one underwater, you needed to be able to breathe underwater to fight it.
Yeah, otherwise you had 8 minutes, and so before you drown, I guess.
Which is not enough time to beat it at all, because from what I understand, it can take a couple hours to have to beat one of those.
Right. And especially because what you'd end up doing is spamming a certain summons. And back in those days, you can't skip the summon sequence. And in particular, there's the Knights of the Round summons that takes like 5 minutes for that freaking summon to finish.
Yes. Granted, it is awesome to watch because you have to go through hell to get that thing in the first place.
Yeah, and I can kind of understand where the animators were coming from, too. They're like, well, we took the time to animate this really cool thing. You fuckers are gonna watch it.
That's right. And it was glorious the first time. It was still cool the second time. And by the 12th time, got old fast.
Yeah. I'm glad they have, like, ways to skip past that in later games, or at least I know in Final Fantasy IX they actually made it a thing where depending on the items in your inventory you get a short summon and it wouldn't be as powerful, but if you got the long animation then it would be more powerful.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yep.
And I know that on the PS4 remaster for Final Fantasy VII and the PS3 remaster, you can fast forward the game, period. You can put it at 3 times speed and walk 3 times faster, fight 3 times faster, and see the cutscenes 3 times faster. It's nice.
Oh, nice. Yeah. I actually, when I was in college, I emulated a lot of Super Nintendo games. And
Shame.
I know, I'm a horrible person.
Copyright infringement, how dare you?
We do not encourage that on this program.
Never.
We've never done that.
I actually have the cartridges for some of them, though. And in this one, I think I did have the cartridge, but I did the emulator in particular because there is a boss that is one of those fights that you are supposed to lose. That is how the plot advances. You lose this battle. But technically, you can grind your way into being able to beat this boss. The game was Lufia 2, and I did it, but I did it by fast forwarding through. Because on emulators, that's one of the wonderful things about them, is you can fast forward it so fast. And so I just grinded so much.
Not to mention you can use save states too, which is nice.
Yeah, I save scrub like a motherfucker.
Yeah, I got to the minimum level you needed to defeat this guy and just reloaded save states throughout the battle to try and get a lucky roll on what his attack sequence was. And after all of that, I got a sword and like a 1-line.
Was it like a good sword?
It was. It was the best sword in the game.
Oh, okay, then awesome.
But it's overkill. You don't need it in any way.
You know what? After all the pain you went through, all of those things you're going to fight from here on, they will know that pain.
Right. And you really do just obliterate everything in your path for the rest of the game. You hit level cap way, way, way before you get to the end, you know?
And at that point, it's like, is it even fun anymore?
The story was good on that one, though.
Oh, that's what matters in the JRPG.
Yeah. This was actually one where I was literally going, no! Like screaming at my TV screen by the end of it. Good times.
Yeah, so
Sounds like it.
Yeah, so I listened to all 3 of the soundtracks for these to do all the research. I was expecting like a grand total of like 2.5 hours worth of.
Oh no!
I think it wound up punching in somewhere in the neighborhood of around 7 or 8 hours of just listening to soundtracks, not including the research I did on some of the tech specs and stuff so that I wouldn't have to come in completely naked.
That sounds like a good idea, but it also sounds like you didn't know what you were getting into.
No, I did not.
I'm sorry, but
I'm also eager to hear what you think of the music as someone who doesn't really know anything about the series, or...
The music's good. I've heard some of the music before, and a lot of times what I'll do is when I'm working on stuff, studying, writing papers, writing articles, video game music is really good to have in the background because it's meant to kind of fade in and just kind of be like it's meant to be background for what you're doing, as opposed to trying to take center stage. And so it's nice just to kind of ease into the music and get into a groove when I work. And occasionally I would pull up a Final Fantasy playlist, usually the newer stuff, and a lot of it was covers. But I did enjoy these four. I guess it was 4, 5, and 6. Four seemed like the most simplistic soundtrack out of all of them structurally. I don't know much about music, so I basically, after 9 hours of listening to music, and I can boil down my opinions to basically 4 was more simple. It felt more straightforward, more kind of, I guess, triumphant would be the word, especially towards some of the later tracks. 5 felt not entirely different, but it felt more complex, and it felt a little bit deeper. The arrangement seemed to have more going on, and there seemed to be a broader range of emotions going on there. And then when 6 came through, 6 actually felt as complex as 5, but it felt like it had the energy of 4. So I think 6 might have been my favorite.
Okay. I'd like to weigh in on that too, because I haven't played any of these games. I've only listened to the music from them, and I have to agree with you on 6. I enjoyed that one the most. And it feels regal. It feels imperial. And I don't know if that plays into how the game is. Ivy, can you weigh in on that?
Yeah, 6 is considered, by people who have, love the Final Fantasy games and have played them all. 6, I think, is probably close to number 1 for favorite game out of them all for the fans. And I think music is a part of that. Also, in the other games, the cast becomes a lot smaller, and 6 had a wonderful ensemble cast, and part of the storyline does involve, battles between nations trying to take down a corrupt empire, that kind of thing. So, yeah, the music definitely plays into that.
Now, I believe you said 6 was your personal favorite, correct?
I love 6. 4 is kind of my nostalgic favorite. And personally, I think 10 is actually my favorite.
Oh, so you like the mindfuck that is the plot of 10?
Oh, I do, actually. I really do. It's not a very it's not a very popular opinion to have, I think, but it is my favorite one out of them. But I did really love 6. I played it so much as a kid, and 4 and 6 are probably the ones that I'm most familiar with as far as I did play through 5 at one point. And of course it hasn't been, I think it's been released as part of the anthologies for the PS1, but prior to that, it had never been released in the US, so
That's right.
That makes it difficult.
It did come out for the SNES in 1994, and it also came out for the PlayStation in 1999 and the Game Boy Advance in 2006.
Oh, I forgot they ported those to the GBA.
They ported a lot of those to the GBA because of the simplistic graphic style.
Right, because the GBA hardware was on par with the SNES. I mean, you had to scale some stuff back. But if you knew what you were doing, the GBA could... It was not at all hard to port something SNES to GBA, and really easy to go SNES to DS.
That's right. I mean, for instance, look at some of the other games that did it successfully. Castlevania, they did that Symphony of the Night game for PS1, and then they did a lot of sequels to it on the Game Boy Advanced, as well as Super Metroid was so good on the Super Nintendo, and then the next game to come out in the Metroid series was Metroid Fusion for the Game Boy Advance, which a lot of people touted it as having an excellent engine, but it wasn't 100% on par with Super Metroid's. It was still fantastic, though.
You know what? We could probably do a whole show just doing a Metroid retrospective if we want to do that sometime.
Oh my god!
Because I just beat AM2R, which is the fan remake of 2, and that could be an entire episode. So I don't want to stray too far away from the music, especially because we have the limited time. Because I've got some stuff I've got to go take care of in about half an hour. I think you said you did too.
But I think as far as how the music grows over time between the 3 Final Fantasy games, is that that's really indicative of the life cycle of a console in general. 2 was released at the beginning of the Super Nintendo's life cycle, so they're still trying to figure out what they can do with what they have. And then, 5 is released a little bit later, so they're like more comfortable, more in the groove of developing things for this console. And then by the time you get to the 6, it's really towards the end of the Super Nintendo's life cycle. They're really comfortable, and they're really just trying to push the limits of what the console can handle at that point. And so I think you kind of also have that with Nobuo Uematsu as a composer, kind of doing the same thing, and probably growing and changing as a composer in general, because it is several years of his life that we're talking about there.
I'd like to agree with that, because Nobuo Uematsu certainly did make great scores. When you listen to his soundtracks for these games, they come across as scores and pieces in a classical ensemble. And it's fantastic to see that years later, they have the Final Fantasy Distant Worlds Orchestra right now. And they have remade a lot of these songs in orchestrated form, which I think he originally envisioned for these games, because they do have that regal imperial sort of feel in 6, and then in 5 and 4 you get that sort of picturesque feel of landscapes and mood, and that coming across in a full 100-piece orchestra or 50-piece, whatever they're working with on specific albums, is phenomenal. They redid Theme of Love from Final Fantasy IV. They did a play off of opera in Final Fantasy VI with Maria and Draco. And then they did Dancing Mad from Final Fantasy VI, which is just ridiculous, because I believe in the original game, that soundtrack spans somewhere over about 17 minutes. So to redo that in classical format, it's beautiful.
Oh yeah, I love it so much, and one of my actually favorite things to play in the car when I'm driving around is just the Final Fantasy VIII battle theme, but the orchestrated version, because they put so many. I mean, it's amazing listening to any of the orchestrated versions for these songs, because it's amazing to me to try to pick out what instrument is doing what and how they're accomplishing those sounds. It's so much fun.
That was Don't Be Afraid, isn't it?
Yes.
That was a real great piece.
In that one in particular, there's a blowing wind sound effect that they accomplish with flutes, and it's just amazing. I love it.
That is excellent. They also did the Liberal Vitali intro.
Yes.
They did that with the chorus as well as the orchestra, and that's beautiful too. That's really got a lot of ambiance and subtlety to it that it comes across in the original game, but it having it in orchestra form is just purely what it feels like it was envisioned as originally.
Right. I sort of imagine Nobuo Uematsu getting the news about what capabilities the PS1 was going to have, and his eyes light up with all the new options and toys he has to play with, for his soundtracks.
Absolutely.
Now I have my entrance, because I actually researched a lot of the tech stuff that went into this. Now, a lot of the really like nitty gritty stuff goes over my head, like when we're actually talking how many hertz a chip can put out. But figuring out, like, trying to process the ways that they played with these chips is really interesting. Essentially, the SNES sound chip acted almost as its own processor apart from the CPU. And it could produce 8 different channels of sound, and it's really hard to figure out exactly what the chip's capabilities were. I found a bunch of stuff on the NES sound chips, and exactly like how which channels were capable only of certain sounds. So what they did was they had those 8 channels, and so uh, he had to write the music. I believe he wrote it on a keyboard, like a synthesizer keyboard.
Like a MIDI keyboard?
Like he wrote it on like the music was written, I believe so. Like I'm not sure if this was him specifically, but I know that a lot of people in the industry, they would start on the MIDI keyboard and then they would export those sound files, and then the programmers would have to find ways to like dissect those sound files and then get them to run on the SNES, because the SNES had its own proprietary form of sound file called
interesting.
I believe it was called the SPC 700 sound files.
So they had a database of specific sounds that were available, and the composers would write their music and then give it to these people, and they would have to find the things that match as closely in those sound files. Is that correct?
Pretty much. And the programmers actually found ways to exceed the processor's limit, because it could only do so many sequences at a time. But what they would do is they would set the CPU to swap the sequences out from the processor and play them like in weird orders, and the sound chip couldn't handle it. So what it would try to do in that place, it would actually create entirely new sounds and pieces. So they faked their way to get extra sounds into the musical arrangements.
Oh wow, that's intriguing.
Yeah. Another fun fact, because I know we were talking a bit about back and forth between Nintendo and Sony. Sony actually was the one that produced all the sound chips for the Super Nintendo and the Famicom and the Super Famicoms.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, Sony and Nintendo got along really well until they didn't. And I think does everybody know that story at this point?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Oh boy, this is my favorite business skullduggery story of all time.
Oh well, please elaborate.
No, I actually I do some teaching, and part of some of the units I do is video games. I always make sure to include this story. So CDs were just kind of starting to come into their own around the end of the life cycle of the SNES, and Nintendo was getting into that because CDs have a really, really big advantage over cartridges. They have exponentially greater storage space, and they are much, much, much cheaper to produce. The only real edge that cartridges have over CDs is that they have much shorter loading times, and I guess they're harder to damage if you're giving them to kids. Yep. So Nintendo went to Sony, and they brokered a deal for Sony to make a disc add-on to the SNES. So basically it's a disc drive, but rather than being an entirely new system, you'd plug it into your existing system, and it would run discs.
Oh, so they sort of like the Sega CD later on?
Yeah, pretty much. And the idea was to stretch out the SNES's life cycle like that. And, the working prototype name was the PlayStation. And so they get to this big conference, and Sony gets up there and they're like, yeah, you know what? We're partnering with Nintendo. They're this huge name. We've been working with them for their sound chips and a bunch of their other components. And here we have this awesome disk drive. It's gonna revolutionize everything. It's gonna like supercharge the SNES, and we're super excited about it. But Nintendo, meanwhile, realized that there was some stuff in the contract that they didn't like very much. Basically, that it gave Sony a little too much control of some Nintendo IPs that were on the system, and they didn't like the way some of the profits were going to be divvied up. And so Nintendo went behind Sony's back and partnered with Philips to do the same thing, and did not tell Sony. So Sony gets up, they do this big press conference on the day of this big event, and then literally the next day, Philips gets up there and says, guess what? Nintendo's been working with us instead. Here we have the Philips CDI, which is going to plug into the SNES.
Oh, no.
And,
oh, man.
And yeah, I can tell by the tone of your voice that you know what the CDI was. Yeah. Like if you've ever seen the YouTube poops of the really awful Zelda games, like the ones that like look they were drawn in MS Paint, Mario was missing. Those were Philips CDI games. Because eventually they decided to just ditch what they were the actual add-on to the SNES itself, but they were still under contract with Philips. Because Philips is like, it's in contract. We get to do like some Zelda games and some Mario games. And Nintendo's like, fine, whatever, just do whatever the hell you got to do. And so that's why we got like Wand of Gamelon, Faces of Evil, Mario is Missing, just all these absolutely atrocious titles that are now infamous today. And then Sony was considering just like throwing in the towel with video games altogether. They're this big multimedia company. They didn't necessarily need the games to begin with, but one of the big wigs at Sony was just so pissed off and felt so slighted that he's like, no, we're going to go forward out of spite, motherfucker. And we're going to keep the PlayStation name.
Awesome.
And then it came into what it is now.
Right, and then
one
actually...
of the best-selling franchise consoles there is.
Well, if you actually look at Sony's business strategy, they almost developed none of their games in-house. Their entire business strategy was just courting the other third parties that Nintendo had burned. Because you can ask anyone, I'm a diehard Nintendo fanboy. They did some shady shit for business, especially back when they were top dog and they knew they could get away with it. They burned a lot of third parties, and so all Sony had to do is just like, guess what? We'll give you better contracts, and we have discs, Square Enix, all those fancy things you want to do. If you come over to us, you could have a disc and not a cartridge.
Right.
Because Nintendo didn't get into the disc game until 2001 when they released the GameCube.
Right. Well, the obnoxious thing is that they went with cartridges for the N64, and then they tried again to make a disc drive for the N64, and they called it the N64DD disc drive, but it was Japan exclusive and it had like 3 games. Like, why do you keep trying the same tactic? This did not work for you last time.
Oh my. So, is that why we got a lot of games like Metal Gear Solid and such moving over to the PlayStation?
Right. Sony just gave them... now, the PlayStation 1 had superior hardware to the Super Nintendo, but inferior hardware to the Nintendo 64. But a lot of companies, they liked that they could do discs as opposed to cartridges, because like something like Final Fantasy VII could not fit on... I think it would have taken... Crap, I want to say something in the neighborhood of 10 cartridges to play Final Fantasy VII.
Holy cow.
Whoa.
And I think 10 is a low ball. I'm actually going to open up my browser and I'm going to Google this really quick.
That's... Oh my god. I mean, you said that creating cartridges would be more expensive than creating discs, so could you imagine playing a 10 cartridge game and how much that would have cost?
Yeah. Oh man, and how do you even do the switching out cartridges? Like programming that.
Yeah, that's a good point. It would have to be, oh my goodness, I can't even think of all the issues that would be involved in that.
Right, and I know it goes back to contract stuff too, because Nintendo, they would do stuff to third parties, like they would say the party itself actually had to pay out of their pocket to buy X amount of cartridges before Nintendo would work with them. So that way, most of the financial burden for production would fall on said third party. So if Sony wanted to create one of these games, they would have to pay for the physical cartridges, and they would have to order. There's like a minimum number they would have to order, and I think that was like case by case. I'm not sure because a lot of this stuff isn't concrete, and it's just stuff I've kind of been picking up over the years. But yeah, so there was a bunch of hoops that Nintendo made third parties jump through. Another one was a religious symbolism. Nintendo was super strict about that's why we had things like crosses removed out of Zelda and Castlevania. They took the blood out of Mortal Kombat, which is an entirely different thing. And
Wow.
Sony just said we're gonna target our system to an older demographic. You can have things like this simple as we couldn't with Nintendo. We're gonna make it much cheaper for you to produce, and there's a couple other contract things. And so their entire business strategy was just to woo over all the third parties that Nintendo had burned, and basically form an anti-Nintendo alliance.
You
That's
know,
really interesting. Sorry.
as far as religious iconography, I guess, goes with Nintendo, then I am surprised that they let some of the things from 6 slide. Because there are, I mean, by the end of Final Fantasy VI, you're pretty much, the final battle is constructed to where the main boss is a god, and you're like,
right.
yeah, you're like committing deicide.
I know, like I think subtext was okay. I think as long as it wasn't explicit, so long as you didn't actually have like a cross or a pentagram going on.
That's right.
Okay.
For instance, taking another example, Super Castlevania 4. Very religious game when you think about it overall. Dracula, demons, hell, being summoned on Earth. But it didn't come through with crosses or any religious text. It came through with subtext. You had holy water that you threw on things, but it never referred to what kind of holy water it would be. You never saw any actual cross symbol except for when you use a specific secondary item, and it just so happens to be like a coffin cross-shaped sort of combo. So it's very interesting how they got around that and still managed to make these religious connotated games without referencing it specifically.
Yeah, the second to last stage of the final boss battle in 6 has 2 characters that you have to fight, and one of them is actually called Maria and looks a great deal like the Virgin Mary iconography. I'm very surprised that they got away with that.
That's interesting.
And it shows up in the music too for that particular part of the battle. That it, the music there goes in a direction towards something reminiscent of classical music and like the the religious music from that era, not necessarily choirs but harpsichord.
Right.
And, those kinds of pieces.
Yeah, that song goes through a lot of iterations. Is that the part where you're speaking of the light organ playing with the harpsichord in the background?
Yes.
That is very religious-esque. You're right about that, because it sounds very churchy, very like somebody's playing the organ at one of the larger churches. That's what it sounds like. And
I gotta...
harpsichord in the background, which in the later iteration of the song that they do with the classical orchestra, they do have a chorus there doing the harpsichord part. So it's
interesting. I gotta say, as someone who plays the piano, I loved it so much as a kid. I tracked down a lot of these pieces for sheet music, and I actually have a few Japan published sheet music books for Final Fantasy 4 through 6, and I also have a sheet music book for Chrono Trigger.
Oh gosh, talk about another great soundtrack, Nobuo Uematsu.
Yes, though I think Yasunori Mitsuda wrote a lot of the music, the majority of the music for that one, but I know he was at least involved, and his name is on a few of the unreleased tracks.
Oh yes, that's right. That was the situation where the other character you were speaking about, I don't remember his name, he started getting stomach ulcers at the end of the game's production. They brought in Nobuo to help wrap up some of the songs.
Yes, and that is another soundtrack that is just incredible. My favorite in particular is one of the mid-game villain, like the one that you think is the villain. You go like through his castle and then fight him at the end of the castle, and the mood music for that castle is so amazing. And then the boss battle, Magus's boss battle, is just one of my favorite tunes.
All right, so I did the math. It's a bit hard to pin stuff down for sure. After about 5 minutes of Googling and like bring up my calculator, it looks so. The N64, depending on which cartridge we're talking, could hold between 4 and 64 megabytes. Final Fantasy VII, from what I can glean from message boards, is 1.36 gigabytes. So, assuming these were full 64 byte cartridges, or megabyte cartridges, it would take 22 carts to play Final Fantasy VII on an N64.
Just not even feasible at that point.
Like, you're buying a crate at that point.
Yeah.
Some people would do it, though. I guarantee you.
Well,
Amazing.
People now would buy that crate, but I'm pretty sure they would not have bought that crate back in 97.
No, definitely not.
Can you imagine being like, hey mom, can you get this for me for Christmas? It's 22 games, or 22 cartridges. God, like, how much would that price point have to be for them to break even? You know, that's a whole other, that's like game theory level, like MatPat level math, and I can't do that right now.
Right. This reminds me a little bit of, there was an indie game called Evoland, and you would do various, it started out as just in black and white, and eventually you get color, and you go from 2D to 3D graphics. And one of the funniest upgrades, I think, was CD. Like, you enter the CD era of games, and so you have these long loading screens between... Every time you change screens, it gives you this loading thing and the little CD spinning, you know? And then eventually you can get an upgrade of, like, you know, not having to deal with the CD era loading times anymore.
Yeah, it's always interesting to me to see how they deal with loading times, because occasionally they'll put mini games on screen, but I think Capcom actually has a patent on that, so other companies aren't allowed to.
I was going to say, you would get a lot of those in games like just the PS1 games, Misadventures of John Bond, or Mega Man Legends, or anything like that, would have like little break periods in between rooms and such. It was interesting.
Yeah, this is, like I said, this is just me kind of pulling from memory. I think Capcom has a patent on that. One of the weirdest tricks to the sky at loading screens I've ever saw was you played Metroid Prime, right?
Oh, yes.
You know how sometimes it'll take for fucking ever for a door to open?
Yes.
That's because it was loading the environment. Because I was,
Yes.
I think I was 13 or 14 when I first played Metroid Prime, and so I'd open the door and it would like the light would go off and the force would go down, like it would be like it opened, and I would just stand there for sometimes 20-30 seconds at a time going, what the hell is going on?
Yeah, I remember that as well. For instance, when you're going from Magmore Caverns to Fangena Drifts or something like that.
Yeah.
Yes, I remember that. Or elevators.
And similarly with Final Fantasy VII, it would sometimes, with the way the environments were constructed, it was hard to tell where the door was, and you would get onto a screen, try to go one way, and end up going back to the previous screen, and it's like, oh god, it's like another 5 minutes of loading time.
Oh yes, I remember that stuff too. Or one of the worst that I can remember is there was a great game for the PlayStation 2 called Burnout 3. Fun game, very cool. But it would just be a static screen with a little loading circle icon at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen for you to go into the next area, and it would be 20 seconds, 30 seconds. I'm going to go grab a drink. I'm going to go hit the bathroom, come back. Oh, great. I get this little stunt run event that I get to play. Cool. 15 seconds of actual action, 30 seconds of seeing the damage afterwards, and then another 20 seconds to 30 seconds of waiting.
I actually started
irritating.
I actually started keeping a comic book with me whenever I was playing Metroid. So like, I love this game. The loading times are ridiculous, and I just like kept a comic book on hand, so I could usually go through like 2 or 3 pages while I waited for the thing to load.
Smart. And then I can go into my Super Metroid fanboy stage here for a second and say that the way they did it on the SNES was great. They had small elevators. They took 10 seconds for you to go from the top to the bottom, just enough time to do something real quick behind you or what have you. And the environments loaded afterwards were enormous. They were large for SNES scale standards and for everything that was inside of them. Very fun.
That was also due to the fact because that's the big advantage of cartridges is that it's a solid state. We're seeing right now people are migrating actually back to solid state from disk drives. It's really popular to take out your spinning disk on your laptop now and then drop in a solid state because they're so much faster and they're so much more efficient. Like I just picked up my Switch today, and the Switch does not use discs at all. It actually has tiny cartridges that look like a DS cart. They actually look about the size of an SD card. And now,
SD cards can hold a lot of information anymore.
In theory, the Switch can hold a 2 terabyte micro SD. Those don't exist yet, but they have released a 2 gigabyte flash drive, a USB drive. That exists right now. It's expensive as fuck, but you can get it.
I know we have a couple of 64 gigabyte micro SD cards here at home that were like $20 or something.
Yes, and then I have a 128 gigabyte micro SD in my digital recorder right now that I'm streaming through, and that was about 25. But you can purchase a 512 gigabyte micro SD for $60.
Well, I know I'm a professional photographer whenever I'm not podcasting, and I've got a bunch of 64 gig cards, and I have about 8 of those, and those are all like high end, like special write speeds. Those all have high end write speed, so those cost about $30 a piece.
Mm-hmm.
But I know I can, if I go to shoot a wedding and I come back, I'll usually have burned through about 4 cards. So storage is a bit ridiculous.
Yeah, you must have a very professional camera.
I do. Well, as the big file sizes, I will say storing it can be a little bit of a pain. But it's basically what you have to do because I have like Batman levels of redundancy. I've got cloud backup for everything, and then I have, every time I need new drives, I don't buy one, I buy 2 and I mirror them. So that way if one drive goes down, I still have a second drive for backup, and I still have the cloud for backup. And because I'm a huge nerd, big surprise on this show, all of my flash drives are named after the little robots that Soundwave would shoot out of him in Transformers.
Oh my god. I like it.
Like I have Rumble, Frenzy, Laserbeak, Ravage, and then I've got Beatbox and Squawk Talk somewhere around here. And it was super embarrassing because I had to help an elderly neighbor just migrate some of her stuff. So I just have this giant drive. You know, I'm gonna like she only has like 6 gigs of stuff on her computer. I'll just grab one of my backup drives and I'll go over there, and you know I'm just wrapping up, and she looks over and she goes, Why is there a label that says Laserbeak?
At least, well, that's not too embarrassing though. I mean, like when I play, did any of you guys play Animal Crossing?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes. Of course, I named my town Hell. And
how old were you? Real quick, how old were you?
25. Well, 21. Yeah, somewhere around 20, somewhere between 21 and 25. And I named my town Hell, and I'd gone around making all of the animals have their catchphrases be things like biznatch, because you couldn't have them say cuss words, so they would say biatch and biznatch and stuff like that. And not thinking my in-laws were visiting, and my little 10-year-old nephew wants to play Animal Crossing.
Yes. Yes.
And it's like, hey Ivy, ready to return to hell?
What's up, biznatch?
And my nephew looks at me and is like, Ivy, why is your town named Hell?
You said because I'm the cool aunt. That's why. You gonna snitch?
They're
Yes.
And I'm like, I don't know. I just thought it was funny, I guess. And so he's playing, and I'm like, please don't talk to the animals. Please don't talk to the animals. Oh,
Like, let's go play Mario. Let's go play Mario. How does that sound? I think the worst I got, it's not quite as bad because none of my family members saw it. So I had just turned 21, and I was with my friend, and we were drinking, and we were playing Pokemon Coliseum. And while we were hammered, you get the option to like name characters and do this other stuff. So while we were hammered, we essentially turned the whole thing into a Les Miserables parallel. So we were naming all the different characters like Les Mis references, and we were like adding music stuff to them, and like trying to like have all this crazy crossover backstory. But then when we sobered up, it was just like, I don't know, name him Butt. We're just gonna name you Butt. I don't care anymore. So
you go from this really elegant crossover backstory to Butt.
Like, evidently, when I'm drunk, I can create all these beautiful, wonderful, elaborate things. Sobering me up, just, I don't know, this guy could be Balls. You're Balls now. I don't care anymore.
Well, my friends and I in college, when we played through 7, we introduced it to one of our other friends, and so she decided to name the characters various things. We named Cloud Jesus, and
A bit on the nose, but it works.
When we meet Eris, she, like, the person playing it took an instant disliking to her and decided to name her Fruitcake. So...
Well, you won't see Fruitcake has this too, so...
Well, you end up with this line where Fruitcake says to her mom, "It's okay, Mom, I'll be safe. Jesus is my bodyguard."
Oh, yeah. There you go.
Oh, man. It was glorious. Just glorious.
How many people could you offend with that? So many.
I'm a little offended just hearing about it.
Oh, that's what I do, man.
Well,
because
we're getting a little bit close to the wrap-up time here, so I don't know what you want to do with that, Sam.
Well, I figure it's about 8:33. Have we covered most of the music stuff? Because I'm not super articulate with music, so that was about all I could glean from that. Most of it I knew was just the backstory stuff. If you guys have finished everything you want to talk about the music itself, that's great. If not, we could always just like record a part 2. Otherwise, I'm down to like record a Metroid episode sometime in the not too distant future.
Ivy, have you played any Metroid games?
Nope, not a single one.
Okay.
You gonna learn today.
It's because I just usually don't do well with action games. I mean, I suck at them so much, so I usually just don't try.
Fair enough.
Well, we'll figure it out. So, yeah, from all of us over here at the Course from Nowhere, signing out. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Hey everyone, real quick before you go. In addition to being an awesome co-host, Ivy is actually a pretty proficient pianist. She's been nice enough to contribute a pair of her Final Fantasy covers for the end of the episode. I'm sure it meant a lot to her if you could leave some love for her in the comments below. Now play us out, Ivy.